It was the old grandfather clock that did it. The one that had stood in the corner of the living room, ticking away the hours, for as long as anyone could remember. No one knew where it came from. No one knew why it was so old, or why it never seemed to fit the rest of the house. It didn't belong, not in the least. Emily had always been wary of it, but it was just a clock. How could a clock be dangerous? It was one of those objects you hardly noticed anymore, its incessant ticking like a dull hum in the background of everyday life, until one night it stopped. At first, she didn't think much of it. Old clocks had a way of giving out from time to time, but when she tried to wind it back, nothing happened. The hands were frozen at exactly 3:15, and no matter how much she twisted the key, it refused to move. The clock had always been a background noise, marking the seconds, the minutes, the hours, but now there was nothing. The next morning, Emily was late for work. She glanced at the kitchen clock, expecting to see the time at least somewhere close to what she had remembered, but it was wrong. The hands were all over the place, far off from the actual time. Panic rose in her chest as she scrambled to her phone. 9:30 a.m. She had woken up an hour late. The disorientation deepened as she walked to the door. The clock still read 3:15. She couldn't shake the feeling that time itself was failing her, slipping through her fingers. When she tried to sleep, she could hear the faintest ticking coming from the living room. Not the slow, rhythmic ticking of the old clock, but something faster, more insistent. Each tick felt like a slow puncture, like a needle in her skull, prickling at her thoughts, dragging her mind through some otherworldly fog. The next day, she could feel the day stretching on, hours slipping away unnoticed. It felt like a dream, like she was trapped inside a loop where time was both infinite and non-existent. At work, everyone else had moved on with their lives, but it felt like she had been stuck in a single moment, forever anchored in the uncertainty of it. The clock wasn't just broken, it was altering reality. Desperately, she pulled at the clock's brass weights and tried to force the hands to move, but it wouldn't budge. The ticking was now louder, as though the clock was breathing, pulsing in the room, growing louder with every second. The sound of the ticking grew deafening, its rhythm now frantic, like a countdown. Emily screamed, but the air seemed to swallow her voice, drowning it in silence. She looked at the clock, still stuck at 3:15. And then for the first time in days, the clock began to chime. It wasn't the sound of a normal hour strike. It was like the clock was crying out, its mechanical voice warped and twisted. Each chime reverberated deep inside her bones, pulling her further into the dark embrace of the house. The seconds, the minutes, the hours no longer mattered. Time had forgotten her. The last thing Emily felt was the weight of the shadows closing in around her, and then nothing. The clock in the living room still ticks, and it's still stuck at 3:15, and no matter how many times she checked it, it never moved, as if time itself had been swallowed whole, and with it the house, the people, the whole world, all trapped in the ticking, frozen forever.